"Get out of here, you filthy beggar!" Vanessa screamed, slamming her fist on the counter. The entire cafe fell silent as Walter's coins scattered across the floor. "We don't serve your kind," she spat, while customers snickered. Tears welled in the elderly man's eyes as he stood frozen, hunger and shame washing over him. His trembling hands clutched emptiness where his dignity once lived. "What would you do if you witnessed an elderly person being treated this way?" The tension in this cafe is about to explode when a mysterious woman notices something unusual about this homeless man. Comment below with your thoughts, like and subscribe to discover the shocking connection that will change everyone's lives forever. You won't believe what happens next. The gentle aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the low buzz of customers in the busy cafe. It had been an ordinary day until the atmosphere shifted dramatically when the door opened, revealing an elderly man. Walter's steps were slow, almost dragging as he crossed the threshold. At 86, he was visibly worn out by life. His thin, stooped body carried not only the weight of age but also years of suffering. His tattered, faded clothes barely protected him from the biting cold of the day, and his shoes, nearly soleless, exposed his ailments. He made his way through the room with trembling hands, trying to ignore the disapproving stares of the customers. The discreet murmurs felt like direct judgments to his ears. The pain of his empty stomach urged him to keep going, each step a battle between dignity and necessity. Walter barely lifted his eyes, fearing the obvious disdain in the atmosphere. He knew his presence was unwelcome, but he had no other choice. Hunger was a persistent companion these days, one that wouldn't leave without being addressed. Arriving at the counter, he placed his few coins on the surface. The owner of the establishment, Vanessa, a middle-aged woman known for her cold temperament, looked him up and down with a disgusted expression. Her apron, once white, was stained with spilled coffee, but the look she gave Walter was even more stained with prejudice. "I just wanted the cheapest sandwich, please," Walter said in a hoarse voice, barely audible over the murmurs around him. His nailed, dirty fingers fumbled with the coins, trying to project some confidence. Vanessa crossed her arms, her expression stern. "This isn't a homeless shelter, old man," she said in a cutting tone that made Walter shudder. "If you don't have money, don't eat." Feeling the weight of humiliation, Walter took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "Please," he whispered. "Anything you can give me. I'm hungry." The plea was almost a whisper, but the desperation in his eyes was evident. The atmosphere around him felt even heavier. Some customers whispered to each other, clearly uncomfortable with his presence, but no one offered to help. "Do you think you can come in here and ask for free food?" Vanessa retorted, leaning in close to Walter, her voice dripping with contempt. "We don't have leftovers here. Go somewhere else." The murmurs turned into quiet laughter. A nearby customer shook his head with a sarcastic smile. "That's right. Get out of here, old man. We don't want your company." With tears in his eyes, Walter froze. He didn't know whether to leave or insist a little more. His stomach growled and shame consumed him. He felt invisible, as if his entire life was being judged in that moment. The awkward silence that filled the space felt even heavier on him. He wanted to disappear, but his legs wouldn't move. Suddenly, when everything seemed lost and hope slipped away from his thoughts, the cafe door opened again. The entrance of an elegant, determined woman caught everyone's attention. Eleanor, with her well-groomed brown hair and wearing a sharp suit, walked confidently through the room. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene unfolding before her. Without hesitation, Eleanor approached the counter. The atmosphere changed immediately. Vanessa, who moments earlier had displayed her arrogance, now seemed uncertain upon realizing the arrival of this influential woman. Eleanor was not an ordinary customer. Known in the city for her luxury boutiques, her presence commanded respect. "What's the problem here?" Eleanor asked, her voice firm and controlled but laden with disapproval. Her gaze fixed on Walter, who was still motionless, trying to maintain the dignity he had left. Vanessa attempted to regain her composure, but failed. The entire cafe was waiting for the unfolding of this unexpected intervention. The tension in the air was palpable. Eleanor looked at Walter and, with a reassuring smile, extended her hand. "Don't worry, sir. Today your lunch is on me." Old Walter looked at her in disbelief, his tear-filled eyes now shining with a glimmer of hope. Eleanor turned her gaze to Vanessa, who, still surprised by the interruption, was trying to maintain her authority. The tension that had previously existed between Walter and Vanessa was now directed entirely toward Eleanor, who exuded a subtle yet undeniable strength. "I already said this man cannot be served here," Vanessa insisted defensively, trying to regain control of the situation. "This isn't a place for that kind of people." Eleanor remained calm, but her eyes displayed an intensity that made Vanessa hesitate. "That kind of people," Eleanor repeated, leaning slightly forward. "I believe we're talking about a human being, not a category, Vanessa." The customers, who had been entertained by Walter's humiliation, now watched with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The scene had shifted dramatically. Eleanor, with her firm and determined posture, refused to back down. Walter, who had kept his head down until then, raised his eyes toward the woman defending him. His trembling hands still clutched the few coins he had painstakingly gathered. He didn't know if he should say something, but the words were stuck in his throat, crushed by shame. "I will pay for anything he needs," Eleanor said, turning her attention back to Walter. "He has the same right to be here as any other customer." Her eyes moved over the faces around, challenging anyone to contradict her. Vanessa, trying to regain control, scoffed. "We don't offer charity here. If he can't pay, he shouldn't be here. That's our business." "Business?" Eleanor interrupted, not changing her tone, but with a slight ironic smile on her lips. "Businesses are made of people, Vanessa, and you seem to have forgotten that." She took a step forward, moving even closer to the counter, now speaking for all to hear. "I've been a customer here for years, and I never imagined I would witness something so inhumane." The whispers among the customers stopped, and silence took over the place. Vanessa was visibly flustered. She knew Eleanor's reputation in the city was strong, and any confrontation could harm her image. However, her arrogance still kept her firm. "This isn't a charity center," Vanessa said, crossing her arms as if that could strengthen her position. "If he doesn't have money, I can't help him." Eleanor let out a brief laugh, but her eyes remained piercing. "You talk about charity, but you don't realize you're treating a person as if they were less than that. Charity is a choice. Humanity shouldn't be." Walter, who had been silently observing, felt a whirlwind of emotions. It was rare for someone to intercede for him, especially with such fervor. The humiliation he had felt earlier began to dissolve into surprise. He never expected that anyone, let alone a distinguished woman like Eleanor, would defend him. He could barely hold back the tears forming in his eyes. Noticing Walter's shaken look, Eleanor leaned slightly, speaking more softly. "Sir, you can eat whatever you want today." She placed her hand over his, gently pushing the coins back. "Keep this. Don't worry about it." Vanessa, feeling the embarrassment grow with each passing second, tried to wrap up the conversation. "Very well, ma'am, if that's what you want, so be it. But this won't happen again," she muttered, her pride still wounded. Eleanor, undeterred, simply smiled lightly and responded calmly. "What won't happen again, Vanessa, is how you treat people here, because I will make sure everyone knows how your business operates." Vanessa froze, aware that her words could have consequences. Meanwhile, the other customers avoided direct involvement, but it was clear that many were now reconsidering what they had witnessed. Walter, finally regaining some dignity, was led to a table by one of the staff, still under Eleanor's watchful eye. She followed him with her gaze, feeling a mix of sadness and satisfaction. There was something about this man that stirred a deep empathy within her, a connection she couldn't quite explain. As Walter settled into his chair, Eleanor walked over and pulled out a chair for herself. "Now, sir, what would you like to eat? You're hungry, so let's take care of that." Her tone, once firm and challenging, was now warm and inviting. Walter, unsure how to express his gratitude, murmured, "I don't know how to thank you, ma'am. What you're doing for me." Eleanor smiled, shaking her head. No need to thank me. Let's just start with a good lunch, and then we can talk. Eleanor watched closely as the waiter, still somewhat reluctant, brought Walter's plate. He placed the sandwich and a cup of coffee on the table without showing enthusiasm. But under Eleanor's stern gaze, he didn't dare say a word. Walter looked at the plate in front of him with a mix of surprise and gratitude. His fingers, still trembling, slowly reached for the bread but hesitated, as if he were waiting for it all to be a dream, ready to evaporate at any moment. "You can eat," Eleanor encouraged with a gentle smile that contrasted with her earlier firmness. "It's yours. You deserve it." Walter nodded, grateful, and took his first bite of the sandwich. The hunger seemed to dissolve all the shame and embarrassment he had felt just moments before. He chewed slowly, almost reverently, while Eleanor watched him calmly, trying to process the strange feeling that filled her chest. It was a mix of compassion and something deeper, something that made her feel an inexplicable connection to this man. As Walter ate, the cafe had returned to a state of forced normalcy. Vanessa, still indignant about Eleanor's intervention, had stepped away from the counter, speaking in hushed tones with the staff and casting furtive glances toward the table where the two were seated. However, the atmosphere still carried a residue of the earlier tension, as if something more was yet to come. It was then that, as Eleanor adjusted her bag on the table, something shimmered on Walter's wrist. Her eyes caught the glint of an old watch. For a moment, she didn't pay much attention, but soon something about the accessory drew her in. There was something incredibly familiar about the shape and style of the watch. She blinked a few times, as if trying to push away a distant memory that was starting to resurface. "Mr. Walter," she said, her tone now tinged with curiosity, "may I see your watch?" Walter, a bit confused, stopped eating and looked at his wrist, as if he had forgotten he was still wearing the accessory. "Oh, of course." He began to carefully unfasten the strap, and as he handed the watch to Eleanor, he commented, "It's a keepsake from someone very important." Eleanor took the watch in her hands, her fingers trembling. The cool texture of the metal took her back to memories she had locked away long ago. She turned the watch over to examine the back, and suddenly her heart raced. Engraved on the underside, in delicate letters, was a name that made her shudder. Thomas. She brought a hand to her mouth in shock. That watch, it was the same one she had given as a gift many years ago to the person who meant everything in her life. That watch belonged to Thomas, the man she had loved and tragically lost. How had that object come to Walter? "Where did you get this watch?" Eleanor's voice trembled as she asked the question. She couldn't take her eyes off the object, as if it had reopened a wound she thought had healed. Walter, sensing the emotion in Eleanor's eyes, was confused for a moment. "It was a gift," he said hesitantly. "A gift from my son, Thomas." His words hit Eleanor like a blow. Her suspicions were correct. Walter's son was the same Thomas who had been her great love, the man whose death she mourned to this day. Her heart raced, and a mix of sadness, surprise, and longing flooded her chest. Walter, not fully understanding her reaction, continued, "Thomas, he passed away many years ago. After he left, life was never the same." Eleanor felt tears begin to form in her eyes, but she fought to maintain her composure. The shock of the discovery was overwhelming. Thomas had disappeared from her life so abruptly, and she never had the chance to say goodbye properly. Now, here was his father, a man shattered by the circumstances of life, holding the only object that connected her to her past. He was my... Eleanor tried to find the words, but the emotions were choking her. Walter, noticing her state, began to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. "You knew my son?" Walter asked, his voice filled with a mix of surprise and pain. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak immediately. She looked at Walter with a blend of affection and sadness. "I loved him," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I loved him more than anything in this world." The silence that followed between them was heavy with unspoken emotions. Walter appeared shocked, unable to process what he had just heard. Eleanor, on the other hand, held the watch tightly, as if fearing that this small piece of Thomas might be ripped away from her again. "Why didn't I ever know about you?" Walter finally asked, his voice a blend of curiosity and sorrow. Eleanor took a deep breath, preparing to revisit the wounds of her past. "It's a long story," she began, looking into the eyes of the man who suddenly seemed much more than just a needy stranger. "But now, I think we need to talk." Eleanor held the watch in her hands, her fingers tracing the familiar engravings. The small token had unexpectedly connected her to a past she'd tried so hard to forget, and to the father of the man she'd once loved with all her heart. "The orphanage became my home," Eleanor said softly, lost in memories. "And it was there that I met Thomas. He was always kind, devoted, so full of life. We had many plans together, plans for the future, until fate changed everything." Walter fell silent, absorbing every word. Eleanor's pain reflected his own, but now, hearing her story, he realized there was a part of Thomas's life he had never known. A side of his son he lost before he could fully understand. His heart tightened with longing, but also with gratitude for finding someone who shared that love. "I never knew about that part of his life," Walter murmured, lowering his head. "After Thomas died, Margaret, my wife, always blamed someone. She would say he distanced himself because of a woman, but she never told me the details. All I knew was that after his death, nothing was the same." Eleanor shuddered at the mention of Margaret, Thomas's mother. She didn't need any explanations to know who Walter was talking about. She vaguely remembered distant and tense encounters with that stern woman whose expectations were unattainable and whose approval was never granted. "Margaret never accepted me," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "She never thought I was good enough for her son, and that created a chasm between Thomas and his family. He was torn between us, trying to be the perfect son while wanting to live his own life. It was a very difficult time." Walter looked up, visibly moved. He hadn't realized how heavy the burden his son carried had been. He never fully understood the conflict that had pulled Thomas away from the family. Margaret had convinced him that the blame lay with the girl he loved. But now, sitting across from Eleanor, he saw that the suffering had been much deeper and more complex than he had imagined. "He never stopped visiting me, but it was rare," Walter said with a long, tired sigh. And then, when the accident happened, Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her throat. The moment she had dreaded hearing was approaching, the point where everything fell apart. Walter continued, his voice growing weaker. "That day, it was so fast. Thomas was with her, and I never knew exactly what happened. He was gone, and the only thing that remained was this watch," his eyes fixed on the accessory in Eleanor's hands, as if it were the last physical connection he had with his son. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back her tears. She had been there that day, the day of the accident, the day everything changed. The memory was an open wound that never fully healed. "I was with him," she confessed, finally breaking the silence. "We were heading to a friend's house together, but we never arrived. The car. There was an accident. It all happened so fast. When I woke up, he was already gone." The tears she had been holding back finally fell, and she covered her face with her hands, allowing herself to sink into the pain of that moment. Walter watched her, equally moved, his own tears silently streaming down the wrinkles of his weary face. "I never knew," Walter whispered, his voice broken by pain and regret. "I never knew you were with him." Eleanor shook her head, trying to control her emotion. "I loved him with all my heart," she said. "And I lost everything that day." She had tried to move on, but the past had always lurked, while Walter had sunk deeper into sadness and regret, until his life was reduced to what she saw now: an old, tired man trying to survive the ruins of his losses. "I can't believe it," Walter murmured, shaking his head slowly. "You were the woman he loved, and I never knew how much that meant to him." Eleanor quickly wiped her tears, struggling to maintain her composure. "I didn't know he was your son until now, but seeing the watch, it all came back, all the memories. He always wore this watch, the gift I gave him when we started making plans for the future." She looked at Walter, who seemed lost in his own thoughts, his eyes fixed on the past. "He spoke little about you," Walter continued, almost in a whisper. but I knew something was pulling him away from us. Margaret, my wife, she never accepted the idea of Thomas being with someone not from our level. She always wanted him to marry someone from society, someone who could elevate our position. His voice trembled, full of guilt and sadness. Eleanor nodded, understanding perfectly. She hated me. Whenever I tried to get close, I felt her disdain, and Thomas, trying to please everyone, was caught between two realities. He was a good man, Walter. He wanted to make everyone happy, but it tore him apart. Walter took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly on the table. I never imagined it would be this way. After he was gone, Margaret and I grew even further apart. She blamed herself, and deep down, I think she blamed me too. That's when everything started to crumble. Eleanor looked at Walter with deep empathy. "And how did you end up here?" she asked softly, as if each word needed to be carefully chosen to avoid reopening wounds. Walter let out a deep sigh, the weight of his story making his shoulders slump even more. After Thomas died, Margaret, she was never the same. She sank into grief, and I lost my footing too. Our marriage couldn't withstand it. The guilt and mourning drove us apart, and I ended up distancing myself from everything. We had a comfortable life, but the emptiness he left was unbearable. Margaret always blamed me, Walter said, his voice choked. She would say that if I had been firmer with Thomas, he would have chosen another path, stayed away from you. And I, in my weakness, believed for a long time that she was right. Hearing this, Eleanor felt a heavy weight in her chest. It wasn't easy for her to hear that Margaret saw her as the reason for the family's collapse. "Walter," she said gently, "it wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. Sometimes life takes us down paths we can't foresee or control. What happened was an accident, but the love Thomas had for you and for me, that love was real. None of this can be diminished by accusations. If you're as moved by this family's tragic past as we are, drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. Will this reunion heal old wounds or deepen them? Like and subscribe to find out how this emotional journey ends." Walter looked at Eleanor with tear-filled eyes, clearly touched by her words. "I never thought I would meet you one day, that I would discover who the woman my son loved truly was. It means so much to me." Eleanor reached out over the table, lightly touching Walter's hand. "We both share the same loss, and somehow that connects us. I don't know why fate brought us here today, but I know we're together now, and maybe that means something greater." They fell silent for a few moments, processing the revelations and the feelings that accompanied them. Thomas's watch was still in Eleanor's hands, and she carefully returned it to Walter, who placed it back on his wrist with a solemn look. "This watch," Eleanor said, her voice soft, "is more than an accessory. It's a symbol of the time we spent with him, of what we shared. And as painful as it is, it also reminds me that time continues to pass, and that we need to find ways to move forward." Walter smiled sadly, understanding the depth of those words. "I don't know how to move on," he admitted sincerely. "After we lost everything, Margaret and I, we ended up on the streets, and now we're just surviving." Eleanor felt a wave of empathy so strong that it made her shift in her chair. "And where is Margaret now?" she asked, her heart tightening. Walter lowered his head. "She's waiting for me in a nearby square. We have nowhere to go, and she's even more broken than I am." Eleanor took a deep breath, sensing that there was something greater to be done. "I want to see Margaret," she said firmly. "I want to help both of you. I can't change the past, but I can try to improve the future." Eleanor's heart raced as she walked alongside Walter through the bustling streets of the city. The words they had exchanged in the café still echoed in her mind. The father of the man she had loved was at her side, and now she was about to meet the woman who had always despised her. Eleanor knew the moment would be difficult, but something inside her told her this was the right step to take. Walter guided her in silence, his steps slow and weary, as if the weight of the years and hardships had drained all the energy he once had. Eleanor's eyes wandered through the city. but her mind was in a whirlwind of thoughts. Reuniting with Margaret was something she had never imagined. The memory of Thomas's mother made her tremble, but she knew she had to face it. Finally, after a few minutes, they arrived at a small square hidden between old buildings. It was a tranquil but worn place, where a few people sat on benches or strolled leisurely. And there, under the shade of a large tree, sat Margaret. The contrast between the woman Eleanor had known in the past and the fragile figure sitting in the shade was shocking. Margaret, once proud and immaculate, was now hunched over, wrapped in an old, tattered coat, her gray hair carelessly tied back. Her eyes, once filled with pride, were now dull, staring into nothing as she held a small bag beside her. Walter approached carefully, as if fearing to awaken a sleeping beast. Eleanor followed closely, her heart in her throat. When they got close enough, Margaret lifted her eyes with an expression of exhaustion that quickly turned to surprise and distrust upon seeing a stranger next to her husband. "Walter," Margaret murmured, her voice hoarse and weakened. "Walter," Margaret murmured. "Who is this woman?" Walter hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Margaret, this is Eleanor. She was someone important to Thomas." The name Thomas fell between them like a stone thrown into a still lake, creating ripples of tension and repressed emotions. Margaret's eyes widened upon hearing the name, and she immediately recognized who stood before her. "Eleanor," Margaret said, her voice a mix of disbelief and anger. You are the woman who took him away from us, the cause of all our misery." The accusation was strong and cutting, and Eleanor felt the impact of those words like daggers. But she took a deep breath, determined to stay calm. She knew that for there to be any chance of reconciliation, she would need to be patient. "Margaret, I understand that you see me this way," Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm here to help. We can't change what happened in the past, but perhaps we can find a way to move forward." Margaret shook her head, her hands trembling as she gripped the bag tighter. You don't understand. I lost everything." "Everything? My son, my life. Nothing makes sense anymore." Eleanor felt a tightness in her chest, seeing the raw pain in Margaret's eyes. There was no denying that this woman was completely devastated by Thomas's loss. Walter knelt beside Margaret, holding her hands gently. "Dear, I know you've suffered. I have too. But we found Eleanor by chance today, and she's willing to help us. Perhaps it's time to stop running from the past." Margaret looked from Walter to Eleanor, her expressions mixing confusion and pain. "Why now?" Margaret asked, narrowing her eyes as if searching for a hidden motive in Eleanor's intentions. "Why, after everything we've been through, would you show up to help us? You owe us nothing." Eleanor stepped forward, kneeling beside Walter to be at Margaret's level. Her eyes were filled with compassion, and her voice was soft but heavy with emotion. "I loved Thomas, and that is something that connects us. I know we've all lost so much, but I'm here to try to do something he would have wanted. He taught me to forgive, to care for others, and I believe that wherever he is, he would want me to reach out to you." Margaret was silent for a long moment, and the gentle wind passing through the trees seemed to be the only thing moving in that square. Eleanor could see the internal battle in Margaret's eyes, a struggle between wounded pride and the desire to finally let the past rest. Finally, Margaret sighed a long, tired breath, as if she were releasing years of accumulated tension. "I don't know what to say." Walter squeezed her hands gently. "Just say you'll accept help, Margaret. We've lived this way for so long. Maybe it's time to change that." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, she allowed a bit of the rigidity in her body to dissolve. "I don't know if I can trust again. I'm not asking you to trust me right away," Eleanor said with an encouraging smile. "But let me try to help. Let's take it one step at a time. I have space in my home. You can stay with me until we find a better solution." Margaret looked at Walter, who was gazing at her with hope and tenderness. Then, finally, she nodded, allowing the tears to fall. "I accept. Eleanor smiled, and in that moment something began to change. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, Eleanor felt they were all moving toward healing. The first rays of morning light illuminated the small living room of Eleanor's home. Walter and Margaret had settled there the night before, still uncertain and cautious about the drastic change in their lives. Eleanor's home was cozy and modern, with elegant furniture that reflected her prosperous life, contrasting sharply with the harsh reality that Walter and Margaret had faced on the streets. Eleanor, sitting in an armchair beside a large window, watched the sun rise, holding a hot cup of coffee in her hands. Her thoughts were tangled. The presence of Walter and Margaret in her home represented much more than just an act of charity. It was an attempt to heal old wounds, to forgive, and perhaps to find a path to peace. Margaret appeared at the door, hesitating, still adjusting to the idea of being under Eleanor's roof. There was something unsettling about seeing that once proud and fierce woman now so fragile, with her shoulders hunched under the weight of years and sorrows. Her eyes were tired, but there was something new in them, perhaps a spark of hope. "You're up early," Eleanor said with a slight smile, motioning to the sofa beside her. "Would you like some coffee?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, as if still pondering whether to accept the kindness, but eventually sat down slowly on the sofa. "Yes, I'd like some. Thank you." Eleanor poured a cup of coffee and handed it to Margaret, who held it with both hands, letting the warmth soothe her cold fingers. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile. "I still can't believe I'm here," Margaret said, almost to herself, looking at the coffee in her hands. "If someone had told me years ago that one day I would accept your help, I would have laughed in their face." Eleanor smiled, understanding. "I get it. And to be honest, I never imagined we'd be here together after everything that happened." Margaret took a deep breath, as if preparing for a difficult confession. "I never looked at you favorably, Eleanor. When Thomas first spoke of you, I immediately knew you were different from what I expected for him. I always wanted the best for my son, and I thought that meant he needed to be with someone who could help him rise in life." Margaret continued softly. Eleanor remained silent, allowing Margaret to open up at her own pace. "But now I see how wrong I was," Margaret continued, her voice trembling. "I lost my son, lost my life, and I blamed you for so long. I blamed you for taking Thomas away from us, for being the reason for all our misfortunes. But the truth is, what happened was much bigger than any of us." Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her throat. Margaret's confession was something she had never imagined hearing. "I never wanted to take him away from you," she said softly. "I loved Thomas, but I know he loved you both too. The decision to distance himself wasn't easy for him. He always wanted to please everyone." Margaret nodded, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I was blinded by pain and pride. For years I fed that resentment, and it destroyed us. Not just me, but Walter too. When Thomas left, I lost my footing. And now, so many years later, I see that you weren't to blame. I just didn't know how to cope with the loss." Eleanor felt her own tears welling up. Those words, heavy with regret and sadness, pierced through the walls she had built around her heart. "We've all lost, Margaret. I lost the love of my life, and you lost your son. We both suffered in different ways, but neither of us came out unscathed from this." Margaret quickly wiped her tears, trying to maintain the little dignity she had left. "I don't know how to thank you for helping us now, after everything I put you through." Eleanor looked at her with compassion. "I don't want thanks, Margaret. What I want is for all of us to find some peace. Guilt and resentment have eaten away at us for too long. I think it's time we let that go, if not for ourselves, then for Thomas." Margaret smiled. A small and timid smile, but genuine. "He would be happy to see this, wouldn't he?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes misty. "Yes, he would." At that moment, Walter appeared in the room, interrupting the delicate conversation but bringing with him a different energy. He seemed more relaxed, as if the simple fact of having a roof over his head and a comfortable bed to sleep in had renewed him. "You two are here talking?" he asked, a light smile on his lips. I think that's a good sign. Margaret and Eleanor exchanged glances and laughed softly. Yes, Walter, we're talking, Eleanor replied, waving at him. I think we're starting to put the past in its place. Walter sighed in relief and sat down beside Margaret, gently taking her hand. I always knew that what we had wasn't living. After we lost everything, the pain swallowed us. But now, maybe we can have a second chance. Eleanor looked at the couple with a renewed sense of hope. You have a place here for as long as you need, but I hope that with time we can find something more permanent for you. You deserve a fresh start. Margaret squeezed Walter's hand, and a shy smile formed on her lips. Thank you, Eleanor. Maybe this is our chance to finally let Thomas rest in peace. Time passed quickly after that morning of reconciliation, and Walter and Margaret began to adjust to their new life in Eleanor's home. The atmosphere, once heavy with unspoken grievances and hurts, was now filled with a sense of peace that they had long forgotten. Eleanor dedicated herself to providing the best for them, offering not just a roof, but also a new perspective on life. The transformation wasn't immediate, but gradually, the presence of human warmth and empathy began to heal their deepest wounds. One afternoon, while Eleanor was organizing papers in the living room, Walter walked in slowly and sat beside her. His gaze seemed distant, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. Eleanor, he began, I've been thinking a lot. I don't want you to feel like we're taking advantage of your generosity. I know Margaret and I have been living here for some time, and I'm immensely grateful for everything you've done for us. But I think it's time for us to start looking for something more permanent. Eleanor looked at him in surprise, but also with admiration. Walter, you're not taking advantage of anything. I'm doing this because I want to help, and because I know that, in a way, it helps me move forward too. But I understand what you're saying. You feel the need for something of your own, right? Walter nodded slowly. Exactly. I think it's time for us to try to build something for ourselves again. Maybe something simple, but that we can call home. Eleanor smiled, touched by Walter's honesty and desire to rebuild his life. I think that's wonderful, and you don't have to do it alone. I want to continue helping, but now in a different way. We can look for a place together, something comfortable where you can start anew with dignity. Walter looked at her, visibly moved. I don't know how to thank you enough for all of this. After so long on the streets, I thought I'd never have the chance to have something like a normal life again. You deserve this new chance, Walter, Eleanor replied tenderly. And so does Margaret. I'm so happy you're ready to take this next step. As they spoke, Margaret appeared in the room, curious about what was happening. Noticing the topic, she approached, still hesitant. Are you talking about leaving here? She asked, looking from Walter to Eleanor. Yes, Eleanor said with an encouraging smile. Walter mentioned that you're ready to look for a place of your own. I think it's an excellent idea. Are you ready for that? Margaret sighed, as if the idea was both frightening and liberating. I don't know, she admitted. Here, I feel safe. After everything we've been through, the idea of going out again makes me nervous. Eleanor stepped closer and firmly but gently held Margaret's hands. I understand, and no one is saying this has to happen immediately. We can take it at your pace, whenever you feel ready. The important thing is that you know you will always have a home wherever you are. And I will always be here to help. Margaret looked at Walter, who was gazing at her with an encouraging look, as if saying they could finally move forward. She took a deep breath before slowly nodding. Maybe it's time to start over. But I want to do it knowing we're not alone. You will never be alone, Eleanor assured her. This is a journey we will take together. In the days that followed, Eleanor dedicated herself to helping the couple find a new home. They consulted real estate listings, visited different neighborhoods, and after a few weeks, they found a small house, simple but welcoming. It was located in a quiet neighborhood near a park where Walter and Margaret could stroll and perhaps begin their lives anew with some normalcy. When the house was chosen, Eleanor helped organize the move and ensured everything was ready to welcome them. The first night in the new home was exciting for everyone. Walter and Margaret, despite their nervousness, We're happy to be able to call that place home. The small living room with its simple furniture and soft light symbolized a new beginning. That night, as Eleanor said goodbye to the couple in front of their new home, Walter warmly embraced her. "You've given us something we can never repay, Eleanor. The chance to be a family again." Eleanor smiled, moved. "You don't need to repay me. Just live this new life with all the love and gratitude in your hearts. That's more than enough." Margaret, who had previously hesitated to show her feelings, stepped forward and hugged Eleanor tightly as well. "I never thought I could forgive or move on, but now I see that forgiveness sets us free. And I'm grateful for you giving us this chance. We're all healing together," Eleanor said, looking at both of them with an affectionate smile. "And Thomas would be happy to see this." As Eleanor stepped away, leaving Walter and Margaret on the threshold of their new home, she felt a lightness in her heart. The past had been painful, but finally, they were all finding a way to peace. A few weeks passed since Walter and Margaret moved into their new home. The adjustment process was slow, but the couple began to create a new routine. The simplicity of life in that small home brought a tranquility they hadn't experienced in a long time. The walks in the park, the conversations at the dinner table, and the small moments of shared silence were a balm for their souls. Eleanor visited them often, always attentive to ensure they lacked nothing. The visits, which had started as short and formal, now became long and relaxed. They laughed together, shared stories, and talked about the future. Eleanor had not only helped them find a new physical home, but also an emotional one, a place where forgiveness and love could flourish. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, Eleanor decided to do something special. She invited Walter and Margaret to spend the day at her house. She had a surprise planned, something that could further strengthen the bonds they had built. When the couple arrived at Eleanor's home, they were greeted with a warm smile and the aroma of a delicious lunch prepared with care. The atmosphere was light, and the sunlight streaming through the windows brought a sense of renewal. "You've come on the perfect day," Eleanor said, guiding them to the dining room. "I have a surprise." Walter and Margaret exchanged curious glances, confident that whatever Eleanor had prepared would be meaningful. They sat at the table, admiring the arrangement of the dishes and the simple yet elegant decor. Before they could ask, the door to the living room opened, and a tall, smiling young man walked in. Eleanor immediately stood up and walked toward him, her eyes shining with pride. "Walter, Margaret, I want you to meet Michael, my son," Eleanor said, her voice filled with emotion. "He just returned from university and was eager to meet you." Margaret's face lit up, and Walter's eyes sparkled with genuine joy. Michael approached the table, extending his hand to greet them. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Michael said with a warm smile, shaking Walter's hand and giving a gentle hug to Margaret, who welcomed him with a tender look. "You look a lot like your mother," Walter commented with a light laugh. "And it's clear she raised you well." Eleanor watched the scene with a heart full of gratitude. This was more than just a family gathering. It was the consolidation of a new beginning, an expansion of the circle of love and forgiveness she had been carefully building. She knew that, in a way, Michael's presence symbolized the continuation of Thomas's legacy. He never had the chance to know their son, but now Walter and Margaret were meeting Eleanor's son, a part of her life that represented the future. During lunch, the conversations flowed easily. Walter and Margaret, who once carried the weight of years of pain and suffering, seemed renewed. After the meal, Eleanor suggested that everyone go to the garden for coffee. Michael, attentive and careful, helped Walter walk to the outdoor area, while Margaret and Eleanor chatted happily about the flowers lining the path. Sitting outside with the sun setting in the background, the atmosphere was one of pure serenity. Eleanor looked around, and for a moment, everything seemed to be exactly as it should be. "I never thought I could have something like this again," Margaret said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The feeling of family, of belonging. I thought those things had died with Thomas." Eleanor gently held her hand. "We're rebuilding this together, Margaret. And now we have a new chance to create good memories, to live more lightly." Walter, who had been gazing at the horizon, spoke softly. "You know, Thomas left us much more than we realized. Even in his absence, he continues to unite us. I feel that somehow he is here present, seeing that we finally found peace." Michael, who had been listening attentively, leaned in and spoke with calm wisdom. "I believe that a person's legacy never completely disappears. Thomas was an important part of all your lives, but now you are all part of my story, my life, and I'm very happy about that." Margaret smiled, a tear rolling down her cheek, but this time it wasn't one of sadness. "You're very kind, Michael. I think, in some way, we're all connected by something greater." The rest of the afternoon was filled with deep conversations, laughter, and a feeling of reconciliation that hung in the air. As evening began to fall, Eleanor took them back to their new home, and Walter and Margaret said goodbye with warm hugs, promising that this wouldn't be the last time they all gathered. As Eleanor walked home with Michael, she felt that finally, the cycle of pain and mourning was closing. The past would always be part of their lives, but the future now seemed brighter than ever. One morning, several months later, Eleanor received a surprising call from Walter. His voice sounded excited, almost youthful. "Eleanor, I have something to tell you. Could you come over today? There's something I'd like to show you." Intrigued, Eleanor agreed and made her way to Walter and Margaret's home. When she arrived, she was surprised to see the place transformed. New curtains adorned the windows, and fresh flowers stood in vases throughout the house. Margaret greeted her at the door, looking more vibrant than Eleanor had ever seen her. Come in," Margaret said, taking Eleanor's hand. "Walter's been waiting for you." Walter was sitting in the small living room, but when Eleanor entered, he stood up with surprising agility. In his hand, he held something familiar, Thomas's watch. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Walter began, "about how this watch is more than just an accessory. It's a symbol of time, time spent, time lost, and time yet to come." Eleanor nodded, wondering where this was going. "Margaret and I have decided to do something with the time we have left," Walter continued. "We're volunteering at the local senior center. We're helping people who, like us, have found themselves alone and struggling." Eleanor's eyes widened with surprise and pride. "It started small," Margaret explained. "At first, we just went to talk to people, to listen to their stories. But then we realized how many elderly people in our community are going through what we experienced. Loneliness, feeling forgotten, sometimes even hunger. We couldn't sit by and do nothing," Walter added, his eyes bright with purpose. "Not after experiencing firsthand both the cruelty and the kindness this world can offer." Eleanor felt a surge of emotion. "That's remarkable," she said softly. "But that's not all," Walter said, an edge of excitement in his voice. "Last week we were at the café, the same one where you found me." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine as Walter continued. "Vanessa, the owner, was there. She recognized me immediately, and I could see the shame in her eyes. She started to apologize, but I stopped her. I told her that what happened that day led to something beautiful. It led me back to Thomas's love, and it led me to you." Margaret stepped forward, taking Walter's hand, "And then we told her about our volunteer work. And do you know what she did? She offered to provide free meals for the seniors we're helping." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "She did." Walter nodded enthusiastically. "People can change, Eleanor. Sometimes they just need to see the impact of their actions through different eyes. The circle is complete," Margaret said softly. "The place where Walter was humiliated is now a source of nourishment for others who might otherwise go hungry." Eleanor couldn't hold back her tears any longer. What had begun as a moment of cruelty and shame had transformed into a ripple of kindness spreading outward. Thomas's watch, the symbol that had connected them all, had become much more, a reminder that it's never too late to make a difference, to transform pain into purpose. "You've turned your suffering into strength," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion, "and your loss into legacy." Walter smiled, a smile of peace and fulfillment. "We've all done it together. You showed us that dignity isn't something that can be taken away by circumstances. It's something we carry within us, and nurture through how we treat others. In that moment, Eleanor realized the profound truth that had emerged from their shared journey. Life's deepest wounds often become the source of our greatest wisdom. The pain that threatens to destroy us can, with time and compassion, transform into the very foundation of our healing. What matters most is not the injuries we sustain, but the choices we make in their aftermath, whether we allow them to harden our hearts or open them wider. The three of them, Eleanor, Walter, and Margaret, had each carried their grief alone for years, each blaming themselves and others for what they had lost. But in finding each other, they discovered that forgiveness isn't just a gift we offer others. It's a liberation we grant ourselves. The resentments that had once seemed like protection had actually been prisons, keeping them locked in a past that couldn't be changed. Now, they understood that true strength lies not in holding on, but in letting go. Not in avoiding pain, but in moving through it towards something greater. Their shared loss had ultimately led them to a shared purpose, and the love they had each felt for Thomas had expanded to include one another, and all those whose lives they now touched. As the afternoon light filled the small room, casting long golden shadows across the floor, Eleanor, Walter, and Margaret sat together, bound not by blood but by something perhaps even stronger, by choice, by forgiveness, and by the knowledge that even life's most painful chapters can lead to unexpected beauty if we have the courage to turn the page. You know, Eleanor said thoughtfully, I've been thinking about that day in the café. If Vanessa hadn't treated you so cruelly, we might never have found each other. Walter nodded, his eyes distant. Life works in strange ways. Sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our worst moments. That doesn't excuse what she did, Margaret added. But it does remind us that we never know the full story of how things will unfold. No single moment defines us, Eleanor said softly. It's the choices we make afterward that determine who we really are. As the evening drew to a close and Eleanor prepared to leave, Walter pulled something from his pocket. A small, carefully wrapped package. We want you to have this, he said, placing it in Eleanor's hands. Eleanor unwrapped it slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, and hanging from it was a small charm in the shape of a watch. To remind you, Margaret said, that sometimes time doesn't heal all wounds. Love does. Eleanor slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, feeling its weight, light, yet significant. Like the burden of the past, they had all finally learned to carry with grace. As she walked home that evening, Eleanor thought about the strange and beautiful journey that had brought them all together. From a moment of humiliation in a café to this, a family forged not from blood but from understanding, not from obligation but from choice. The path hadn't been easy. There had been tears and revelations, painful truths, and difficult conversations. But standing now on the other side, Eleanor knew that every step had been necessary. Every moment of discomfort had been a doorway to deeper connection. In the end, what had saved them all wasn't wealth or status or even time. It was the simple, profound act of seeing each other, truly seeing beyond appearances, beyond prejudice, beyond the walls we build, to protect our wounded hearts. And that, perhaps, was Thomas's greatest legacy. The reminder that love, in its purest form, is always about seeing, about recognizing the humanity in each person we encounter, even when it would be easier to look away. Thank you for journeying with Walter, Eleanor, and Margaret as they found healing through forgiveness. What moment in their story touched you most deeply? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Remember, sometimes our worst moments lead to our greatest blessings.